Seat 28C. She didn't look up when his voice came through the overhead speakers. Her husband was in first class, but his words filled every row of a plane she owned. He said he'd been carrying dead weight for years, and today that ended. The woman in 28C kept her hands folded and said nothing. Not one person on that flight understood what the quiet woman in the grey cardigan was about to do. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. But to understand why she didn't move, we have to go back to the beginning of that morning. Nora Bennett had booked the economy seat herself. Seat 28C, window row, near the back of the plane. She could have put her name in any seat on this aircraft. She could have had the captain pull the plane to the gate just for her. But she didn't want that. She had chosen 28C deliberately, the way you choose the last page of a book you already know the ending of. She wanted to watch one final time, from the back of the cabin, the man she had married before she walked away from him. She arrived early. She always arrived early. She found her row, stowed her bag, a plain canvas carry-on, the kind you bought because it was practical, not the kind you bought to be seen with, and folded herself into the window seat. Grey cardigan, dark jeans, no jewelry except the small shape pressing through the fabric at her collarbone that she had worn every important day for 30 years. The plane filled around her. A middle-aged man in a work shirt settled into the aisle seat and immediately opened a paperback. He didn't look at her. She appreciated that. She watched through the scratched oval window as the tarmac crew moved in their orange vests below, and for a moment she thought of her father, of the way he had moved around a plane like a man who understood every bolt and cable as a living thing. She closed the thought gently, the way you close a drawer that holds something fragile. Up at the front, past the blue curtain separating economy from first class, her husband Tyler Bennett was settling into a wide leather seat. Nora knew because she had watched him board. He hadn't looked back once toward her section. He never did. He was traveling with his mother, Carol, and with a woman named Simone Park, who wore the uniform of a flight attendant on this very airline and was traveling today as Tyler's guest. Nora knew Simone's name. She knew more than that. She had known for months. And Tyler's sister, Rachel, was also aboard, 3 rows behind first class, phone already out. The seatbelt sign chimed. Nora settled back. Then the intercom clicked. Not the captain's voice. Something different. A passenger's voice, what warm and self-assured. The voice of a man who had always known how to hold a room. Good afternoon, everybody. Tyler's voice moved through every overhead speaker, down every row, into every headrest stitched with the company name that bore her father's legacy. Sorry to interrupt your flight, but I've got something I've been waiting to say, and I can't wait one more minute. A few people smiled. Someone near the front made a soft, delighted sound. A birthday, maybe, or a proposal. People love those on planes. Nora did not turn her head. For a long time, Tyler said, I was married to a woman who made me feel like I was never enough. You know, the kind of quiet that's really just cold? Sympathetic murmurs drifted back from the forward rows. But then I met somebody who makes me feel like the man I was always supposed to be. He paused. Simone, right there in the galley, I'm asking you to be my wife. The cabin exhaled. Someone clapped. The sound swelled soft and approving, the warmth of strangers sharing in something they believed was beautiful. Nora closed her eyes. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for it the same methodical way she prepared for everything. Quietly, completely, without involving anyone who didn't need to know yet. Still, hearing his voice fill the cabin of her own aircraft, his words sliding between seats that bore her company's name in gold thread on every headrest, pressed on something in her chest she hadn't fully anticipated. She opened her eyes. From near the front, Rachel came walking backward down the aisle, phone raised, already filming. She panned from the galley where Simone stood with her hands over her mouth, back toward the rows of economy seats. Say something for the camera, sis. Rachel stopped at row 28 and pointed the lens directly at Nora's face. Her voice was bright and deliberate and enjoyed itself. "Come on, don't be shy now. You're going viral today." Several passengers shifted. The people who had been smiling a moment ago were starting to understand the geometry of what they were watching. From first class, Carol Bennett's voice carried easily over the quiet murmur of the cabin. She was speaking to the woman beside her, but she was speaking loud enough for the whole plane to hear. "Some women you upgrade, darling, and some women you leave behind. That's just how it goes." A few people laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Enough that the sound wrapped around Nora like cold water and settled. The man beside her, the one with the paperback, went very still. Then Tyler came back down the aisle. He walked the full length of the cabin and stopped at row 28. He didn't look at the man beside Nora. He didn't acknowledge the passengers watching from both sides. He looked at Nora and set a folder on her tray table. Divorce papers. Her full legal name at the top. Her signature line waiting at the bottom. "Sign these before we land," Tyler said. His voice was low, meant for her, but not low enough. "Do it quietly, Nora. For once in your life, just do it quietly." Nora looked at the folder. Then she looked up at Tyler. Her right hand rose slowly and found the small hard shape beneath the cardigan at her collarbone. "Okay," she said. Tyler smiled. He turned and walked back to first class without looking at her again. The man in the aisle seat set his paperback face down on his knee. He was a broad man in a work shirt, unremarkable in every way, and he spoke without making a performance of it, barely above a whisper. "You all right, ma'am?" Nora didn't answer immediately. She looked at his face, just the plain, unperforming concern on it, and something shifted in her chest that she hadn't expected. In the last 30 minutes, not one person on this plane had thought to ask her that. Not Tyler, not his sister with the camera, not a single one of the passengers who had watched it happen. Just him. A stranger, with a paperback and a work shirt and the basic human instinct to ask. "I will be," she said quietly. She reached under the seat in front of her, pulled out her bag, then stepped past him into the aisle and walked toward the rear lavatory without looking toward the front of the plane. Near the back galley, a young flight attendant named Maya stood very still. She had been watching since the intercom clicked. Now, as Nora passed her, something moved across Maya's face. Not pity, not sympathy. Recognition, and something that looked very much like awe. Without a word, Maya turned and walked quickly up the aisle toward the front of the aircraft. Toward the cockpit. They had been broke together first. That was the part Tyler would spend years forgetting. Nora met him at a fundraiser for a regional scholarship program. She was helping set up chairs. He was working the door for a firm that had taken him on as a junior consultant straight out of business school. He was handsome in a worn kind of way, the handsomeness of someone who had learned to dress well on a careful budget, and when he smiled at her across the folding table, it was the kind of smile that didn't perform for an audience. It was just for her. "You look like you've set up 1,000 chairs, he said. "I've set up 1,000 chairs, she said. He laughed. It was real. Those were the details she would remember years later, the realness of that laugh, how it didn't practice itself in a mirror first. They dated for 14 months before he proposed. They got married small, a courthouse ceremony with 20 people in folding chairs that Nora, out of habit, had arrived early to arrange. His mother, Carol, had attended. She wore a dress that was slightly too formal for the occasion, and shook Nora's hand with both of hers, and said she was so happy to finally meet her. The warmth had the texture of something rehearsed. For the first few years, they were building the same way Nora had always built things, quietly, from the bottom, one piece at a time. She had her aviation consulting work. He had the consulting firm he'd started with a former colleague, 3 clients, and the kind of ambition that needed constant tending. He was good with people. She was good with numbers. Together they handled the apartment, the bills, the usual anxieties of early adulthood. He brought her coffee in the morning without being asked. She fixed the things in the apartment that broke because she knew how. They were, for a time, genuinely equal. Then his firm hit its wall. It happened in the 3rd year of their marriage. 2 of his 3 anchor clients pulled back their contracts in the same quarter. The firm's cash position tightened fast. Tyler spent 3 weeks grinding through pitch calls that went nowhere, coming home later and later, quieter and quieter, until the silence between them was a third presence at the dinner table. Nora watched. She did not ask him about it outright. She knew he was embarrassed by it, and she knew him well enough to know that pressure from her direction would make it worse. But she was not passive. Her father had spent 30 years in the regional aviation world before it took him, and in that time he had built a network of mechanics, fleet managers, cargo coordinators, and small business owners across 4 states who had worked with him and trusted him, and mourned him when he was gone. Some of those people were still operating. Some of them needed the kind of marketing and operational consulting that Tyler's firm did well. Nora made 2 calls. She framed them as referrals from a family contact in the industry. She did not say her own name. She never mentioned it to Tyler. 3 weeks later, Tyler came home with the energy she hadn't seen since the early days. Bright eyes, standing a little straighter. "Babe," he said, "I don't know what shifted, but I think things are turning around. 2 new clients, both strong. I think the pitch work is finally landing." "That's great," Nora said. She was making tea. She turned back to the kettle. She didn't think much of it at the time. It was something she could do, so she did it. She didn't need to be thanked for it. That was how her father had operated. He fixed things and moved on without ceremony, and she had absorbed that from him the way children absorb everything, without knowing they were doing it. But she noticed something in Tyler's voice that she would carry with her for years. When he said, "I don't know what shifted," he said it with relief and with something else, with pride. The kind of pride that is also a story a man tells about himself. "I pushed through. I kept going. I made this happen." She said nothing. She poured her tea. The following spring they had dinner at Carol's house for the first time. Carol lived in a suburb north of the city, in a house that was well maintained in the way of people who care deeply about the impression a house makes. She cooked a roast and set the table with cloth napkins. She asked Nora about her work in the careful way people ask when they expect an answer that confirms what they already think. "Aviation consulting," Nora said. "Regional, mostly?" Carol nodded. "That sounds stable," she said. It was not a compliment. It was placed like a marker. "Here is where we are locating you, and here is where you will stay." Later, over dessert, Carol refilled Nora's glass without asking and set her hand briefly on Nora's arm. "You seem like someone who tries very hard," she said. Her voice was warm. Her eyes were not. "Tyler has always been drawn to people who work hard. I think that's a lovely quality." Tyler laughed and squeezed Nora's hand under the table. He didn't hear it. She did. She kept her face easy and pleasant, and under the table her free hand found the hem of her cardigan and pressed it against her collarbone, against the small, hard shape of the wings pin she wore even under her good clothes. She had brought it with her today the way she brought it everywhere important. Her father's voice was very quiet in her memory. "Anybody can be loud, baby girl. Takes a strong person to be quiet and still get it done." She smiled at Carol and thanked her for dinner. Tyler did not notice her hand beneath the table. He never did. It happened slowly. That was the part that made it so difficult to name at first. There was no single moment that Nora could point to and say, "There." That was where he stopped. It was more like watching a tide go out, gradual, almost imperceptible, and by the time you noticed the waterline had dropped, the beach was already half dry. Tyler's career accelerated in year 4. His firm secured a larger client than another. The client list began to include names that opened doors at the kinds of restaurants that put their prices in small print. Tyler bought new suits. He started getting invited to industry dinners, association events, conferences. He attended them. He came home late, but he came home with the good energy of a man moving upward. And for a while, that energy filled the apartment in a way that felt like presence. He stopped asking her to come with him to the events. "You'd find it boring," he'd say, already straightening his tie. "It's just a lot of handshaking. You know how those things are." She did know. She attended several dozen such events a year under her own name, in a professional context Tyler knew nothing about. But she said nothing. She said, "Have a good time." She went back to whatever she'd been working on. Carol started calling more frequently. On Tuesday evenings, mostly, which happened to be the evenings Tyler was usually home for dinner. Nora could hear the calls from the kitchen, Tyler's voice softening into that particular register he used only with his mother, younger and easier, the voice of a man who had never had to be complicator in that direction. The calls lasted longer than they used to. Afterward, Tyler was sometimes a little quieter, a little more inside his own head. Once, finishing the dishes after one such call, Nora noticed him looking at her from across the kitchen, with an expression she couldn't fully read, not unkind exactly, but assessing, like a man rechecking the terms of something he'd agreed to years ago. She didn't ask. She dried the dishes and went to bed. In the 6th year, she found the hotel receipt in his jacket pocket. She wasn't looking for it. She was pulling the jacket out of the closet to take it to the dry cleaner, and the receipt slipped out of the interior pocket onto the floor. She picked it up. She looked at it. A hotel she didn't recognize. 2 nights, a date she had no memory of being associated with a trip Tyler had mentioned. She stood very still in the closet for a moment. Then she folded the receipt carefully and put it on her side of the bathroom counter. She never mentioned it. She didn't confront Tyler. She called her attorney instead, a woman named Patricia Wexler, who had handled Nora's company documentation for 6 years and who knew precisely the difference between a personal matter and a legal one, and she said she thought it might be time to begin organizing certain protections. Patricia asked no questions. She said she'd prepare the documentation. After the call, Nora opened Tyler's contacts. She scrolled to S. The name was there, Simone Park. The number had a local area code. No notation, no label, just a name and a number, the kind of entry you make when you don't want to make it findable to someone who might look. Nora memorized the name. She closed the phone. She put it back exactly where she'd found it. A week later, she ran the name through her company's HR system with one quiet inquiry and received a personnel file in return. Simone Park. 29, flight attendant based at the City Hub, hired 3 years prior. Performance reviews. Excellent. No disciplinary notes. Nora closed the file. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't cry. She simply knew, and knowing was not yet the same as being ready to act, but it was the first step in that direction. What she remembered most from those weeks was not grief, not yet, but a strange clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when the thing you suspected finally has a name. The ambiguity was over. The question of whether she was imagining things, whether she was being too sensitive, whether she was misreading a man who simply worked long hours and had a close relationship with his mother, that question dissolved. She wasn't imagining it. She had never been. One evening that month, she was in the kitchen when she heard Tyler's voice from the other room. He was on the phone, the easy, unguarded kind of phone call that people make when they don't think anyone is paying attention. She heard him say, "She's fine. She's always fine. That's actually the problem with her. She never needs anything." A pause, then a laugh. Exactly, exactly. Nora set down the knife she was using to cut vegetables. She stood very still for a moment, her hands flat on the counter. She had spent 11 years being fine. She had been fine through the lean years and the growing years, and the years when his career expanded into rooms that had no space for her. She had been fine when Carol looked through her rather than at her. She had been fine when Tyler stopped asking her along, stopped calling from events, stopped lowering his voice when she was in the room. She had been fine because she was, genuinely, capable of being fine, because her father had raised a person who could carry hard things without showing the weight. But she understood now, listening to him laugh at her fineness, that what she had offered as strength had been received as absence. that the very quality she had thought was a gift to him had become, in his accounting, the evidence against her. She picked up the knife again and finished cutting the vegetables. She made dinner. She set the table. When Tyler came in and sat down and said, "The food looked great," she thanked him and asked about his day. That evening, after he fell asleep, she opened her laptop in the home office and signed 3 documents for Lee Sky Holdings, a procurement approval, a route expansion filing, and a capital reserve authorization that her CFO needed by morning. And she signed each one with her maiden name, Leigh, not Bennett. Then she closed the laptop and went to bed. To understand what Nora had built, you had to first understand what had been taken. Calvin Leigh was not a famous man. He was not a man who appeared in newspapers or gave speeches or had his photograph taken with people who mattered. He was a mechanic, an aircraft mechanic specifically, and a good one. The kind of good that is not about speed or flash, but about knowing deeply and precisely the particular language of machines. He could listen to an engine cycle and tell you what was wrong with it the way a doctor listens to a chest and hears the difference between a healthy heart and one that's working too hard. He had grown up poor in a small town that the interstate had bypassed, the kind of town that stays exactly the size it is because nothing pulls people toward it. He worked at a small regional airfield at the edge of that town, starting as a line technician at 19 and working his way up over a decade, until the airfield was as much his as anything not legally titled can be. Then slowly, with the caution of a man who had learned not to rush anything important, he started building a 3-plane charter operator at first, small routes, agri-charter, cargo, private charters, occasional medical transport. He hired 8 people and paid them more than he paid himself. The planes were old, but they flew, and they flew because Calvin maintained them with the kind of attention that came not from a checklist, but from understanding what you were responsible for when someone stepped aboard. He called it Leigh Air. He had a small sign made, vinyl, blue letters, nothing fancy, and he put it over the hangar door, and every day after school, Nora would come to that hangar with her backpack still on, and sit on an overturned bucket near the maintenance bay and watch her father work. He would hand her wrenches, he would explain things, he would point up at the planes, crossing the clouds above the cracked pavement, and tell her what he was building. "I want to fly people like us," he'd say, wiping his hands on a rag. "People nobody ever thought to give a window seat to. That's the whole thing, baby girl. That's all I'm trying to do." She believed him the way children believe their fathers, which is to say completely, without conditions, from a place that is not yet old enough to protect itself. She was 9 years old when he called her over to a workbench one evening and took something out of his shirt pocket, a small pin, silver, the shape of a pair of wings, old, the edges worn soft from years of a thumb rubbing it. "A man gave me this a long time ago," Calvin said. "He crouched so he was at her level. He believed in me before anybody else did. Now I'm passing it to you." He pinned the wings to her collar, right over her heart. His hands were careful and deliberate, the hands of a man who handled fragile things with respect. "One day you're going to fly higher than they'll ever let a leaf fly. You keep these close." He looked at her, and remember, real wings don't make noise. They just lift. She kept the pin. She never took it off on the days that mattered. The trouble came in her teenage years, and it came from a direction that no amount of mechanical skill could have prepared Calvin for. Apex Aviation was not a scrappy company. It was a regional carrier with real money behind it, and lawyers who knew how to use delay as a weapon. They wanted the airfield land. They wanted Leigh Air's routes. They wanted the whole thing, and what they couldn't buy, they were willing to dismantle. They spread word in the industry that Calvin's maintenance standards were slipping. They had inspectors make visits. Nothing was wrong. Every citation was contested. Every finding overturned, but the process itself took months. And during those months, Leigh Air couldn't expand, couldn't attract new contracts, couldn't do anything but defend. The regional carriers that had been feeding Calvin cargo began redirecting to Apex, The relationships dried. A lie in a nice suit beats the truth in coveralls. Calvin had said that too in the later years, and there was grief in it. He lost the operating certificate 2 years after the campaign began. He fought it through administrative review and lost again. By the time Nora finished college, Leigh was gone, the sign taken down, the hangar quiet, her father sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, going cold in front of him, and his hands folded on the table the way hands fold when a man has run out of things to do with them. He died the winter Nora turned 28. His heart, the doctors said, but she always thought it was something more complicated than that. What nobody knew, what even his attorney had barely understood in full, was what Calvin had done in his last year. Quietly, carefully, the way he did everything. He had transferred every asset he still controlled into a family trust with Nora as sole beneficiary, the hangar land, which he'd managed to retain through a separate holding. The maintenance equipment. 3 leased aircraft agreements that could be converted to ownership at favorable terms. A small reserve fund, not much, not by any standard that would have impressed anyone at the firms Tyler eventually worked for, but enough. Enough to start something. Enough for someone who knew what to do with it. The day after Calvin's funeral, the family gathered back at the house and ate food that neighbors had brought over and talked about him in the past tense. And Nora sat at the edge of it and held her coffee cup and pressed the wings pin through her coat with one hand. She wasn't saying goodbye, she was making a promise. The following Monday morning, she called a regional aviation licensing office from her car, window up, heat running. Her voice was steady. "I'd like to file for an operating certificate," she said. "Applicant name, Leigh Sky Holdings." The administrator on the other end asked for a mailing address and a primary contact. Nora gave her maiden name, her professional address, her direct line. "And the founding owner of record?" the administrator asked. "Nora Leigh," she said. "That's me." She built it the way her father had taught her to build things. One bolt at a time, no ceremony. In the first year, Leigh Sky Holdings was a licensing number, an address, and 3 converted lease agreements on planes that were old enough to be unglamorous but maintained well enough to fly. She hired 6 people, a ground ops manager, 2 mechanics, 2 pilots, and an administrative coordinator, and she paid them out of the trust reserve with the focus of a woman who knew how far the money had to stretch. The routes were regional. Cargo at first, then small charter contracts, the kind of business that doesn't get written about in industry publications, but that sustains itself through reliability and the referral networks of people who have been let down before by carriers who prioritized growth over follow-through. Calvin had built Leigh on exactly that principle. Nora rebuilt Leigh Sky Holdings on the same one. She did all of this under her maiden name. Tyler knew she had professional work in the aviation sector, Himano consulting clients, that she attended the consulting clients, that she attended the occasional conference, that she maintained professional contacts from before their marriage. What he did not know, because he had never asked with the specificity that would have required honest answers, was the scale of what she was building. She hadn't set out to deceive him. In the beginning, it was simply that the company was too small and too fragile to survive attention. She had watched Apex Aviation destroy her father in part by making his work visible before it was strong enough to withstand scrutiny. She was not going to make that mistake. She was going to build quietly in the dark until what she had built was too large to be threatened by what anyone thought of it. Then years passed, and the company grew, and the question of when to tell Tyler became hard to answer to, not easier. Year 3, Leigh Sky Holdings had 12 planes and 200 employees. Tyler's firm had stabilized. Their marriage had a comfortable rhythm. She told herself she would tell him when the time was right, when there was a natural opening, a moment where it wouldn't seem like she had been keeping secrets deliberately. The moment didn't come. Year 5, 40 planes, 800 employees, a route network that stretched across 3 time zones. Tyler got a major contract that Nora had facilitated through an intermediary, A hospitality subsidiary of Leigh Sky Holdings had needed marketing services, and she had directed the work to Tyler's firm without connecting the dots for him. He came home that evening, thrilled, talking about the new client, and she said she was happy for him, and meant it, and didn't say the rest. Year 7, Leigh Sky Holdings made its first acquisition, a competitor, a small carrier that had been struggling. The deal was covered briefly in a regional trade publication. Tyler read about it over breakfast and said, "Huh, never heard of them." He turned the page. "Small company," Nora said. "Good for them," Tyler said. He didn't ask. She noticed that he didn't ask. She noticed it not with resentment exactly, but with a kind of precise attention, the way you notice a thing that tells you something important about a person's shape. Tyler was not incurious by nature. He asked plenty of questions about things that interested him, things that touched his own life, his own ambitions. He simply didn't ask about hers. Her work existed in the category of things that were fine, things that sustained themselves, things he didn't need to worry about. That was not cruelty. It was something more ordinary and in some ways more final. It was disinterest. Year 10, 42,000 employees, routes across the country, the rebuilt hangar, new roof, smooth pavement. The Leigh Sky Holdings name on the sign over the door was the operational center of a company whose value, if anyone had looked up the filings, would have numbered in the billions. The name was on everything, every paycheck, every operating certificate, every lease and contract and regulatory filing. The name was Leigh, not Bennett. Tyler had lived inside that company for years without knowing whose it was. The apartment they lived in, the rent was drawn from an account that traced back, through 2 subsidiaries, to Leigh Sky Holdings' operating income. The car Tyler drove, bought with money from that same account. The marketing contract his firm was most proud of, Leigh Sky Holdings. Third-party brokered, his firm's largest retainer client. He had never connected the name at the top of the paper with the woman sleeping beside him. She had thought about it in the years when the marriage was still good, about the day she would show him, about what his face would look like, about whether he would be proud of her or frightened, whether he would feel the way her father had felt when a dream came real, the particular wonder of it. She had imagined that conversation many times. It had always felt like a gift she was saving for the right moment. Then the right moment never came, and the marriage went somewhere it couldn't come back from. The morning of the flight, she stood at the bathroom mirror with the wings pin in her hand. She had made her attorney call the previous week. She had prepared. She had spent 3 years quietly, organizing everything that needed to be organized. She was not going on this flight because she hadn't had a choice. She was going because she had chosen to be there. She had booked seat 28C herself. Economy, rear of the plane, window seat. She wanted to see one last time, from the back of the aircraft that bore her family's name, whether the man she had married was the man she remembered. She already knew the answer. She had known for months. But there is a difference between knowing something and closing the door on it. She needed to close the door. She pinned the wings to the inside of her collar, over her heart, and picked up her bag. She was ready. The folder sat on her tray table. She did not pick it up. She looked at it the way she looked at any document she intended to read carefully, with patience, without urgency, the way her father had looked at an engine before he opened it. Take your time. Understand what you're dealing with. Around her, the cabin had shifted. The mood that Tyler's announcement had created, that brief, soft celebration of a stranger's apparent romance, had slowly, visibly drained. People were beginning to understand. She could see it happen in pieces. A woman 2 rows up, who turned slightly in her seat, then turned back with her jaw tight. A man across the aisle who had been smiling a minute ago and was no longer. The particular discomfort of people who had been made unwitting participants in something that turned out not to be beautiful. From the front, Rachel's voice continued its narration, though it had gone a little louder, a little more insistent. The performance of someone who was committed to a bit, and is waiting for the reaction that will confirm it was worth it. She's not even moving, y'all. Ice cold, Tyler always said. She panned the camera slowly across the row. If you're seeing this live, comment below, are y'all surprised? Because I'm not. Carol's voice again, from first class, not directed at Nora but easily audible, addressed to whoever was sitting nearest to her. When a man outgrows a situation, there's a certain kind of woman who can't accept it. You hate to see it. You really do. Nora listened to all of it. She let it settle. She looked at the folder, at her name, typed in clean block letters at the top. At the signature line with its small arrow sticker, the kind lawyers put on documents when they want to make the signing feel uncomplicated. She thought about what was listed on those pages. On Tyler's side, the consulting firm, its accounts, its client list. The apartment, whose lease, traced 3 steps back, bore the name Leigh Sky Holdings. The car, purchased through a subsidiary account she had set up long before Tyler ever drove it. The travel account, corporate, under her company's umbrella, which Tyler had charged more than $40,000 to in the past 2 years without ever looking at the issuing entity's name. She thought about Simone Park in her uniform, the uniform that said Leigh Sky Holdings on the epaulette tag, in small white stitching. None of these were the things that hurt. Not the money, not the assets, none of the things that could be counted. Those were just facts. What hurt was the boy who had walked 2 miles in the rain once to bring her dinner. What hurt was the version of Tyler she had believed in when he had nothing to believe in himself. That was the wound, not this folder, not these papers. Just the distance between that boy and this man, the particular, immeasurable distance between who someone was and who they became. The man in the aisle seat had set his paperback on his knee. He was watching forward, not looking at her, giving her whatever privacy a middle seat could give. He was a broad man in a worn work shirt, with the kind of hands that had done actual work with them for a long time. He had not filmed anything. He had not leaned over to get a better look. He had just been quietly present, in the next seat, doing exactly what a decent person does when the person beside them is going through something they have no business interfering with. When he spoke, he didn't look at her directly. He spoke to the seat back in front of him, just slightly above a whisper. "You all right, ma'am?" She turned her head. She looked at his profile, the unremarkable straightforwardness of it, the absence of anything calculated in it. In the past 30 minutes, not one person on this plane had asked her that, not one. She had been filmed. She had been narrated. She had been used as the punchline of a joke Carol told for an audience of strangers. She had had divorce papers dropped on her tray like a verdict, and not a single person who knew her name had thought to ask if she was all right. "I will be," she said. He nodded. That was all. He picked up his paperback again. Something in her chest moved, not softened, exactly. She was past softening, past the place where small kindnesses could undo anything. But something shifted, the way a compass needle shifts when it finds true north. She noted it carefully and filed it away. She reached under the seat in front of her and pulled her bag onto her lap. She opened it and looked at the folder one more time. Then she rezipped her bag, stood up without hurry, and stepped past the man into the aisle. She walked to the rear of the plane. The lavatory was occupied. She waited at the back, near the galley, watching the seatbelt case overhead. Maya, the young flight attendant who had been stationed near the rear for most of the flight, was refilling a beverage cart nearby. She was young, mid-20s, maybe, and she had been careful, since before the announcement, to keep her face neutral in the professional way that flight crews learn early and practice for years. But now, as Nora waited, Maya glanced at her, just briefly, and then she set down the pitcher she'd been holding and spoke very quietly, her voice low enough that only Nora could hear it. "Ma'am, I recognized your name on the boarding pass manifest when we processed the flight this morning." She paused. Her voice had the tremor of someone saying something that felt dangerous and necessary at the same time. "We have your standing instructions. The captain is ready to proceed whenever you are." Nora stood still. "Not yet," she said. She looked at the lavatory door. The occupied light clicked off. She opened the door and stepped inside. She locked it behind her. The lavatory was small. They always were. A mirror over a tiny sink, fluorescent light that was not kind to anyone. The constant low vibration of the aircraft moving through air 30,000 feet below the open sky. Nora set her bag on the little shelf above the toilet, locked the door and looked at her reflection. And then, for the first time in years, she let it happen, not loud. Never loud, she had learned quiet the way some people learn a second language, early and thoroughly, until it was more natural than anything else. But the tears came, hot and fast, the way they do when they have been waiting a long time. Her shoulders moved, she gripped the edge of the small sink with both hands and let herself feel the full weight of what the last 10 years had actually cost. The wedding, she had been so happy at their wedding. A courthouse, yes, with folding chairs and 20 guests and Carol in her slightly too formal dress. But Nora had been happy in a way she could still remember precisely. The color of the light that afternoon, the weight of Tyler's hand holding hers, the feeling that she was stepping into a life she had chosen for herself. The early apartment. The Friday wine they'd shared on the floor because the couch hadn't arrived yet. The phone calls he used to make in the middle of the day, just to say he was thinking about her. He had been that person once. She had not invented him. He had been real. The years she had worked through nights while he slept, building Lee Sky Holdings from a licensing number and 3 old planes into something her father would have barely recognized, something large enough to carry the name Calvin had loved and been robbed of. She had done that while being a wife, while making dinners and attending Carol's holiday functions, and listening to Tyler's work frustrations, and absorbing, quietly and without complaint, every small reduction of herself that had accumulated over a decade. And the thing he had said on the phone that night, she never needs anything. She pressed her hand flat against her mouth and held it there until the sound stopped trying to come out. Her shoulders stilled. Her breathing leveled. Her other hand found the collar of her cardigan. She reached inside and unpinned the wings, held them in her closed palm, edges pressing into the skin. She thought of Calvin in the hangar, his voice, even and unhurried, explaining things she was too young to fully understand. But that somehow settled into her, anyway, the way an engine breathes, the way a wing finds lift, the way a dream survives in the hands of the right person, even after the person who first dreamed it is gone. She thought of the day he pinned these wings on her, the way he had crouched to be at her level, his hands, careful, precise, the hands of a man who understood the responsibility of handling fragile things. One day, you're going to fly higher than they'll ever let a Leigh fly. She looked at herself in the mirror. The fluorescent light was unforgiving, but she wasn't looking for flattery. She was looking for something else, looking to see if the person in the mirror was still the person she had always been underneath everything Tyler and Carol and the 10 slow years had said about her. She was. She wiped her face. She cleared her eyes. She pinned the wings back to the inside of her collar, pressed them flat against her chest, held her palm over them for a moment. Then she raised her eyes to her own reflection and said, very quietly, to no one but herself, "You were never carrying me, not one single day." She said it the way you say a thing you have needed to say for a long time, finally out loud in the only room where you can be sure no one is performing for. She stood there another moment. The knock came gently, 2 taps, measured, respectful. "Ma'am," Maya's voice, barely audible through the door. "I'm sorry to disturb you. The captain is asking for your confirmation. We're approaching the descent window, and he wants to make sure he has your timing." Nora looked at herself in the mirror one final time. Something she had been carrying for a very long time had just shifted, not released, not dropped, but moved to a different position. The way you shift a heavy bag from one shoulder to the other. You still know what you're carrying. You've simply found a better way to hold it. She turned to the door. "Tell him we're ready," she said. "Tell the crew to take their positions." A brief pause from the other side. "Yes, ma'am," Maya said. Her voice had changed, quieter, more formal, the particular register of someone who has just crossed from one kind of moment into another. Nora heard her footsteps move away up the aisle, quick and purposeful. She splashed water on her face. She dried it with a paper towel. She checked her collar, the wings pin, invisible under the fabric but present, as it had always been. She picked up her bag, she unlocked the door, and stepped back out into the aisle. The seatbelt sign for chimed. And then, over the intercom, the captain's voice came on. It was not the voice of a man announcing altitude and weather. It was a different voice, careful and deliberate, the voice of a man about to say something he had prepared for. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said. His voice moved through the overhead speakers, through every row, every headrest, every oval window seat in the aircraft, on the same intercom that Tyler had used an hour and a half before to announce his engagement. The same channel, the same speakers, a different kind of authority. "On behalf of the entire crew of this flight, it is the honor of my career to acknowledge that traveling with us today is the founder and chairwoman of Leigh Sky Holdings." A brief pause, measured. "Her father's name is on the door of every hangar this company flies out of. Her name is on every paycheck this crew has ever received. It is my privilege to welcome aboard Ms. Nora Leigh." Silence. Not the silence of a crowd that didn't hear, the silence of a cabin that heard perfectly, and was only now understanding what it had heard. It started at the rear of the plane. Maya was standing near the back galley. She straightened her spine. She turned to face row 28. The empty seat with the folded tray, the divorce papers still sitting on the tray table. She stood at attention, hands at her sides, eyes slightly lowered. The way you stand for someone whose name is in the fine print of the contract that put food on your table. Then the flight attendant stationed at the middle galley set down the beverage tray she'd been holding. She turned the same direction and stood the same way. Then the one at the forward galley. Then the crew member in the jump seat near the front exit. One by one, in a quiet chain that moved from the rear of the aircraft toward the nose, every uniform on the plane turned toward the empty economy seat in row 28 and went still. Heads slightly bowed, hands at sides, the posture of people who understand exactly what they owe to the person whose name makes their work possible. The silence spread outward from the crew like something physical, from them to the passengers nearest the back, who had watched it start and now craned to look toward the front, confused, then not confused. From those passengers forward, row by row, the murmur of understanding moving through the cabin like a current, into first class, into Carol Bennett, who had been refilling her glass, her hand stopped moving, into Rachel, whose phone was still recording. The little red light blinked steadily, but Rachel's face was doing something she would not have planned for it to do. Her hand had lowered slightly. Into Simone, who was standing near the front galley in her uniform, and who looked down at the epaulette tag on her shoulder, the small white stitching that said Leigh Sky Holdings, and then looked up with an expression that was not what anyone who had seen her 40 minutes ago would have recognized. And into Tyler. Tyler Bennett sat in his wide leather first-class seat with a half-finished glass of champagne that the airline had provided, because the airline provided champagne in first class because it was his wife's airline, and had always been his wife's airline, and the expression on his face underwent a slow, complete transformation that was difficult to watch and impossible to look away from. "Leigh," he said. His voice came out small and cracked on the word. That's just her maiden name. She uses her maiden name for work. That has to be a different," but the crew was still standing. Every one of them, from the front to the back, oriented toward row 28 like a compass pointing north. And the name was on every headrest tag in the plane. It was on the overhead panel above his seat. It was on the safety card in the seatback pocket in front of him, the one he had pulled out and never looked at when the flight attendants demonstrated the procedures. The name was everywhere. It had always been everywhere. He had just never looked at it. Nora Leigh, not Nora Bennett. Not his wife's name. His name, the name he gave her. Her name, the name she had carried from a leaking hangar on the edge of a small town that the highway forgot, and had written at the top of 42,000 paychecks, and had quietly, patiently, one route at a time, put on the door of every facility they flew out of. The door in the rear lavatory opened. She came up the aisle. She wasn't rushing. She had never rushed anything. She walked the length of the economy cabin past the standing crew members and the staring passengers with the unhurried quality of a person who has somewhere to be and knows exactly how to get there. The wings pin was under her cardigan, as always, invisible to everyone. But she knew it was there. At the curtain, she paused for a single beat. Then she pushed through into first class. Tyler was looking at her now. He was finally fully looking at her, the look she had not received in years, the one that sees a person rather than a category, a presence rather than a fact of life. His face was pale. The glass was still in his hand. Carol's mouth was open. Rachel's phone arm had dropped all the way to her lap. Simone had taken one step back from the galley doorway, then another, the small instinctive retreat of someone who has just grasped the full nature of the terrain they're standing on. Nora stood in the aisle of first class and looked at her husband. She was calm. She was completely, genuinely calm, not the performance of calm that she had maintained all her life under the name fine, but the real kind. The kind that lives on the other side of fear and grief and a lavatory mirror at 30,000 feet. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she spoke. "Get up," she said. "Not out of your seat, just up. Look at me." Tyler lifted his eyes to his wife's face. It was the first time in a very long time that he had really done it. Nobody breathed. The first-class cabin had the quality of a room where something irrevocable is about to be said, where everyone present understands that the next few minutes will be referenced later, and that there is nothing to do now but be still and let it happen. 10 years, Nora said, and that's the first time you've really looked at me. She said it the way you note a fact, not with bitterness, but with the precision of someone who has been keeping accurate records. Isn't that something? Tyler didn't answer. His hands were on the armrests. She reached into the seat pocket in front of him. She pulled out the divorce folder, the one he had dropped on her tray table in economy, the one she had not touched. She set it on his tray table now, his property, his papers. "You wanted me to sign these quietly," she said. "You know I signed something quietly once before." She let that sit for a moment, long enough for the words to find their weight. "A promissory note. 3 years into our marriage, when your firm was underwater and the bank wouldn't extend credit, and you were too proud to tell anyone how bad it was. I drew from my own accounts and I routed the funds through an intermediary, so it looked like investor interest. I signed my name on a note that gave your business a reason to survive, and I never told a single soul." Carol made a sound, very small, just a breath, quickly swallowed. "I also made 2 phone calls that same quarter," continued. "Former clients of my father's. I pointed them toward your firm. I didn't put my name on it. I wanted them to find you on your own terms." She paused. "You came home that week saying you didn't know what had shifted, but you thought things were finally turning around." Tyler's jaw had tightened. "Year 5, she said. "Your firm's largest retainer client. The hospitality subsidiary that's been billing you every quarter for 4 years, that is a subsidiary of Leigh Sky Holdings. That's been my company's money coming back to you. You never looked at the parent entity name. Nobody moved. The apartment lease." She kept her voice level and quiet, the voice she used in board meetings, when she wanted to make certain the room understood that what she was saying was not a question. "Drawn from an operating account, 2 subsidiaries from my personal holding, the car. The corporate travel card you've been using for the past 2 years, $40,000, Tyler, on my company's account, with my maiden name on the issuing entity if you had bothered to read the statement header." She tapped the folder once, "The seat you're sitting in, the champagne in your glass, the uniform on Simone's shoulder, the terminal we'll land in. Baby, those were always mine." Carol found her voice. It had lost most of its carrying power. Nora, sweetheart, we always admired we never meant to. Nora turned her head toward Carol. Just her head. Her voice did not change. You were right about one thing, Miss Carol. She said it without anger, which made it more devastating than anger would have been. Some women you upgrade. Some women were the whole airline the entire time. Carol stopped speaking. Simone had taken another step back. She was no longer near the galley doorway. She was pressed against the forward bulkhead, arms crossed, and she was looking at Kofi, at Tyler, with an expression that was not love or tenderness or the flush of a new engagement. It was the cold arithmetic of someone who has just discovered that the ladder they've been climbing is attached to the wrong building. Rachel's phone was up again. The red recording light still blinked. Her hand was not steady. "Rach," Tyler said. "I know," Rachel said quietly. She lowered the phone to her lap. For the first time on this flight, she didn't have anything to add. Tyler looked at Nora, really looked at her, the way he had failed to for years, the way he had looked at her in the courthouse 12 years ago and maybe 3 or 4 times since, in the accumulated lifetime of their marriage, looked at her as a person rather than a fact he had long since stopped examining. "Nora," he said, "baby, I didn't know." "No," she said. "You didn't." A pause. "Real wings don't make noise, Tyler. My father said that to me when I was 9 years old in a leaking hangar with cracked pavement and 3 planes and a dream that nobody thought was going to survive. And he built something, and then they took it from him. And then I built it back, quietly, one piece at a time. For 12 years, she looked at him. You could have known. You were there. You just never asked." The plane banked slightly. Through the first-class windows, the city was becoming visible below. A grid of lights and roads, the airport approaching in the distance. "I'm not your dead weight," she said. "I was never your dead weight. I was the ground under your feet the whole time, and you were too busy looking up to notice what was holding you." She let that be the last thing she said in that cabin. She turned. She walked back through the curtain into economy, past the standing crew who had not moved, past Arthur in his aisle seat who had his book closed in his lap, and gave her the smallest nod as she passed. Just a nod, just acknowledgement. Nothing that cost anything or asked anything in return. She sat down in seat 28C. She reached into her bag and took out a small envelope. Plain white, sealed, Tyler's name on it in her handwriting. The wheels kissed the runway. The plane slowed and settled into the ground. She was already through the gate when she heard him behind her. "Nora." Tyler's voice in the arrivals hall, not the intercom voice, not the performance. Just his voice, raw and small, trailing after her through the crowd. "Nora, wait." She stopped. She turned. He came toward her with the divorce folder still in his hand. Carol somewhere behind him, Rachel's phone finally put away. He looked like a man who had just understood something that had been obvious to everyone else for a long time. He looked tired. He looked, for the first time in years, his actual age. 10 years, he said. That has to count for something. I didn't know, Nora. You have to believe that. If I had known. Tyler, her voice was quiet. She had always kept her voice quiet. I know you didn't know. She reached into her bag and held out the envelope. That's why this is in here. He took it, he looked at it, his name in her handwriting on the plain white front. Inside was a settlement. Her attorney had prepared it 6 months ago, and it was fair. More than fair, given the facts. It accounted for the years, the contributions on both sides, the reasonable interests of a man who would need to rebuild his life without the foundation he hadn't known he was standing on. Enough for a fresh start for someone who chose to use it that way. She had not had to give him anything. She had prepared this anyway. She pulled off her wedding ring, the plain band, the replacement for the original she'd sold years ago when Tyler's business needed it. She set it in his open palm on top of the envelope. She looked at it there for just a moment, the small gold circle, the 12 years it represented, the particular weight of an ending. Go build something honest, she said. It's the only kind that lasts. She turned and walked into the light of the terminal, her head up, the crowds moving around her. The weeks after moved the way the aftermath of large things always moves, not dramatically, not in a single wave, but in a series of smaller ones. Simone Park received a personnel reassignment notification from Leigh Sky Holdings HR, effective immediately. Reassigned to the shortest domestic routes in the network, the ones that ended in small terminals and didn't put her in front of anyone whose goodwill mattered to her career. The notification cited no disciplinary cause. It didn't need to. People who work in companies understand when a decision comes from the top and does not require explanation. Rachel's video, the one she had planned to go viral, did go viral, just not the way she had planned. The internet learned quickly who the quiet woman in the grey cardigan actually was, and it learned what Rachel had said to her face, and it learned what Carol had said loud enough for a whole cabin to hear. The comments ran in a direction Rachel had not anticipated. She took the video down. The copies that others had made remained. The internet does not let you take things back. Carol went home to a well-maintained house in the suburb and sat in a kitchen that was very quiet and thought about the 10 years she had spent whispering into her son's ear that he was too good for his wife. She thought about the fact that she had drunk champagne on her daughter-in-law's airline without knowing it was her daughter-in-law's airline. She thought about what it meant that the woman she had worked for years to push out of her son's life had been, quietly, the reason the life Tyler was so proud of was possible at all. She didn't call Nora. Some recognitions come too late to be useful as anything but a lesson. 3 weeks later, Nora visited the hangar. It had a new roof now. The pavement was smooth. The sign above the door said Leigh Sky Holdings in the same blue lettering her father had once painted on vinyl and tacked above a leaking door, except now it was lit permanent and visible from the road. Planes moved in and out of the maintenance bays, all day on routes. Calvin had sketched on napkins over coffee, routes for people nobody had thought to give a window seat. Nora stood in the middle of the main bay, in the spot where she had once sat on an overturned bucket at age 9 with a wrench in her hand. The air smelled the same, oil and metal and fuel, and something underneath those things that she could not name but had always been home. A girl was watching from near the bay door. She had been there for weeks, the ground crew told Nora. She showed up after school and stood at the edge of the work area and watched. Maybe 12, grease on her hands already, the eyes of someone who has found the thing that makes the world make sense to her and cannot look away from it. Nora walked over. The girl looked up. Nora reached to her collar. She unpinned the wings, her father's wings, worn soft at the edges from 30 years of his thumb and 30 more of hers, and she crouched down until she was at the girl's level, the way Calvin had once crouched in front of her. "These were given to me by my father," she said, "a man who believed in me before anyone else did. Now I'm giving them to you." She pinned the wings to the girl's collar, right over her heart. The girl stood very still, watching her with wide, serious eyes. "One day you'll fly higher than anyone ever said a girl like you could fly. You keep these close. And you remember, real wings don't make noise." Nora looked at her. They just lift. Somewhere behind them, a plane rolled toward the runway, its engines rising to a clean, sustained note. Then the note softened, and the plane was up, and from the ground there was no sound at all. Just the wide blue sky, and somewhere in it, out of sight, 42,000 people going places they'd been told they couldn't reach. If this story moved something in you, leave a comment below. And if you believe the quiet ones always have the last word, subscribe, because the next story just might be yours.